I recently got a quote from a local company on how much it would cost to extend my patio, screen it in, and lay some pavers. The price it gave me was pretty high, but understandable seeing this type of work is extremely laborious, takes time, and whoever's doing it needs to make a profit. But $22,000 is way too much for me, so I'm gonna do it myself and see if we can save some money. And we're gonna extend the existing patio out by 4 feet because we plan on screening it in and building an outdoor kitchen. But after leveling out the ground and tamping it down really well, our first Lowe's order arrived, and it ran us exactly $2,588, which included 35 bags of cement, 60 pavers, and a bunch of wood so we can build the frame to this patio. We started off by bringing all of the concrete bags into the backyard and putting them into the mold that we made earlier because this is where our slab is going to go. We then busted open all the bags because we're going to be doing something called a dry pour, which I've never done, but I hear it's a lot easier because you don't have to mix 35 bags of cement. You basically just pour the dry concrete into the mold, then spread it out and try to make it as level as possible, which sounds easy, but it took us hours and hours to make the slab look flat and level, to the point where I feel like it would have been quicker to just mix the concrete by hand and pour it. But we were way too invested at this point and weren't going to look back, so we got this slab as flat and level as possible, then grabbed the garden hose and misted over the entire slab carefully so it can start to harden. I then came back every hour and sprayed the crap out of the concrete, then let it sit for a few days so it can cure. After patiently waiting a couple of days, I came over to the slab and took the molds off, and it still seemed a little wet, so I let it sit for another day. But since this patio is going to have an overhang, we ran a chalk line so we can drill some holes so all of our post brackets would be lined up properly. After drilling the holes, I hammered in these concrete bolts that I got from Lowe's. And these are pretty cool because once you put them into the concrete and tighten them down, they expand at the bottom, making a nice secure place to put a post bracket. But we then put the bracket on, tightened it down, and repeated the same process over and over until all the brackets were installed. My son then came over to help, and what I love about doing these DIY projects is that I get to teach my kids a bunch of different things, which will help them grow up to have a bunch of different skill sets that might help them in the future. I mean, I remember doing a bunch of projects with my dad when I was a kid, and it really helped me become the person that I am today. After cutting this 2x6 down to size, I put on this flashing tape on the back side of it, because it's going to be going in between this board and the house, and I want to make sure that it stays protected just in case any water gets behind it over time. I then secured the board to the house using these 6-inch exterior lag screws. We then painted the board white because we're going to go for an exposed beam look, and it's just easier to paint as you go. Once the 2x6 was installed, I had to notch out this 4x4 post to allow another 2x6 to fit into it because that's what's going to hold up the other side of our roof. Once I got all the 4x4s notched out and made sure the 2x6s were nice and flush, I brought the post over to the brackets and installed them. We made sure each post was nice and level, screwed them in, then brought over the 2x6 that'll rest on top of the notches that we put into the post earlier. Then secured it into place using 3-inch exterior screws and primed it as well. After priming the board, we had to install the rafters, so we measured and cut a bird mouth into each one, then made sure that it would fit properly and installed them all 16 on center. So far, we've spent $2,588 on this entire build, and we still have a decent amount of materials left. So I'm pretty hopeful we'll be able to build out this entire patio for less than half the money that we were originally quoted, but we'll see how it goes throughout the build. After installing the rafters, I hit them all with a quick layer of primer, then added some blocking in between each rafter to make sure no bugs get inside after we screen in the patio. Which is really the main reason I wanted to build a screened-in patio. Every time I use my backyard, mosquitoes just bite the crap out of me, which really makes my backyard useless, so hopefully this helps. I then added some caulking in between all the cracks, then just like that, the frame to my patio was all finished up. Since we're going for an exposed beam look, we primed and painted all of the OSB sheathing before putting it onto the roof. We cut all the pieces to size, then brought them over to the roof and secured them to the rafters using 2.5-inch deck screws. To make sure no water gets in between the house and the overhang, I'm going to use this piece of drip edge and install it underneath the siding and let it hang over the roof, so that if any water gets in here over time, this will make sure it doesn't leak underneath, which sounds pretty good to me. I then installed some of this flashing tape in between the roof and the drip edge, then installed some more drip edge around the entire roof and topped it off with some more flashing tape. After installing the drip edge and the flash tape, we glued on some of this ice and water sheathing, which goes underneath the shingles to help prevent leaks over time. Now that the roof is prepped, it's time to install the shingles. And I'm doing a stair-step method, which allows you to practically have no waste. You basically start off with one shingle and make 3 rows, each row being shorter and shorter as you get to the top. You then install the rest of your shingles and continue the same process over and over till your entire roof is complete. And while we were installing the roof, we heard on the weather forecast that there was a severe thunderstorm about to come in, and it had already started to rain, so we were in a little bit of a hurry to get this roof finished up. But then it cleared up, so there was really no need for a rush, but at least we got the roof done. Now that the roof is finished up, we picked up these black joist hangers and installed one onto each rafter. And we paid a little extra money for these, but since we're going for the exposed look, we figured it would be worth it. After installing the joist hangers, I pulled out the miter saw and my Bluetti power station so I can start to build the walls for my screened-in porch. But we're building walls that are 36 inches tall so that the screen doesn't go all the way to the ground to help prevent things from hitting it so it can last as long as possible. But then my supervisor showed up to make sure I was doing everything correctly, and once I got their stamp of approval, they even helped me put up the frame for the doorway, which fit perfectly. The next day, we finished framing out the walls and used pressure-treated 2x4s and 3-inch exterior screws to put everything together. We also made sure everything was nice and level, then primed everything with exterior primer to not only preserve the wood, but also to match the house. And at this point, we were pretty much out of materials. We just had a few small things left, so we had to make another Lowe's order, which ran us another $1,792, but it included all the materials for the siding, the screen tracks, some paint, some caulking, and a few other materials. And in between, I ran back and forth to the store a couple times to get some exterior screws, a couple saw blades, a shovel, and a rake, which ran me another $120. So that brings a total to $4,500 so far, which isn't too bad, but we still have a lot to do, so let's see how much we end up spending by the end of this video. After painting everything, it was time to install the siding. This exterior paneling runs about $60 a sheet, and the reason we chose it is because it's the same materials we used on the gym we built in the previous video. It also looks good and it's pretty freaking easy to work with. After installing the paneling, we ran a bead of caulking over all the exposed edges, even though they're going to be covered by the screen tracking. Then miter cut these PVC trim pieces to give the exterior of this patio a nice board and batten look. After installing all the trim pieces, I ran a bead of caulking on all the edges and the screw holes, then painted all the trim pieces this nice gray color. Then just like that, the siding to this patio was all finished up. While the paint dried, it was time for lunch. So I got in the kitchen and made us some Peruvian chicken, broccoli, and spicy cilantro cauliflower rice. And for the drinks, I got us some freshly squeezed juice. Hope was impressed. She had no idea that all along I was such an excellent cook. But little did she know that these meals came from Factor. Fresh meals that get delivered right to my door and are ready to eat in just 2 minutes. I just popped them into the microwave and put them on a plate to get rid of the evidence, poured the freshly squeezed juice into cups, and that was it. Since we work so much, we rarely get the time to cook, and most of the time we even forget to eat. But since we started ordering Factor meals, it really helps us stay on track, especially for lunch. They only use premium ingredients and can do vegan, keto, veggie, and specific calorie meals, which is freaking fantastic if you're on a busy schedule like us. So head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code BuildersBlueprint to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month's order. That's code BuildersBlueprint50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month's orders. But now that we ate, let's get back to the video. Now that the siding's done, we're gonna install these tracks onto the frame so then we can install the screen. These tracks are super cool because they hold your screen in place and also allow a piece of trim to clip into them to give your screen a nice professional look. I'm gonna link them in the description below, as well as a bunch of other things that I've been using in this video, just in case you guys want to build your own screen in Patio. And at this point in the build, I was super freaking excited because this thing was coming out much nicer than I was expecting it to, and I wasn't even finished yet. But I next cut the screen to size, then brought it over to the track and used the spline to put in between the track that will hold the screen in. And if you're doing this, make sure to pick up this little rolly tool that allows the spline to fall into the track because it makes life a lot easier. But we then cut off the excess screen, then repeated the same process over and over until all the screens were installed. Once the screens were in place, we clipped on these white trim pieces, which made everything come together really nicely. Now that the patio screened in, we wanted to add some rocks around the entire perimeter of the house because every time it rains, it splashes dirt onto the house, making it look dirty, and rocks will prevent that. After leveling out the ground with a rake, I marked 22 inches away from the house, then installed this plastic trim to help keep the rocks in. We had to make another trip to Lowe's to pick up some weed barrier and a bunch of rocks, which ran us exactly $401, which brings the total to $4,901 so far. We used the metal rake to spread out all the rocks, and this made a hell of a difference. It was starting to look so nice. My son then came out and said that he loved it, so he gave me a hand. Once we got up to the doorway, we wanted to add some pavers there, so we flattened out the ground, tamped it down really well so we can go ahead and add the pavers. We used a 20-year weed barrier, some leveling sand, and this foam paver base before laying the pavers. I really took my time with this and made sure the ground was as level as possible before laying them down because this is my house and I really want it to last as long as possible. But I then added some more rock and laid some more pavers on the other side that I didn't film just because I didn't want to bore you guys to death. We then picked up this PVC screen door from Lowe's, which ran us another $110 and installed it. We added a PVC strip on the inside that will work as a door stopper, added a handle, then just like that, the door to this patio was installed. Since we have big dogs, they can easily jump up and hit the screen, so we decided to add a dog door to help preserve this screen because we just worked our asses off for 2 weeks installing it and I really want it to last as long as possible. After installing it, we ran a bead of caulking around it and the dogs immediately started using it. I think this is going to work out. To help keep water away from the entrance, I wanted to build an overhang above the door, so I used a bunch of scrap wood that I had laying around to put it together. I framed it out, added a piece of sheathing, then installed some drip edge. And since all the materials that I'm using to build this overhang were scraps from the build, it didn't add any extra money to the project, which saved my pocket and made my wife happy. After putting it together, I brought it over to the patio and screwed it directly into the frame. I also added these support beams, and I had some extra soffit pieces left over from the previous build, so I ended up using those as well. To finish it up, we picked up this fascia board that ended up costing us 22 bucks, but we wanted to cap it off to make it look as nice as possible. And as a finished touch, we bought this little plant hanger so we can hang a plant right at the entrance. To help things look as nice as possible, we decided to add some plants. So we picked up these trellises from Lowe's, some dirt, some pots, and a bunch of plants, which ran us another $297, which to me was completely worth it because it's going to make this space look so much better. And to be completely honest with you, I'm kind of a sucker for plants. I frequently find myself in the garden section of Lowe's and Home Depot just looking at flowers and shit because it's freaking calming, so if you ever see me in a garden section, don't be scared to come say hi. We next wanted to run some pavers in between the house and the gym, so we dug up the ground and spent a couple days leveling it out and tamping it down really well. Doing this took a lot longer than expected. It took us 3 full days just to get the ground ready so we can lay the pavers. And looking back, if I ever do this again, I'm gonna rent the machine so I can dig up the ground just to speed up the process, because this shit was really labor intensive, which made me realize why it cost so much to do. And we had already bought all the materials, so we really had no choice but to just get it done. We leveled and tamped down the ground really well, added a 20-year weed barrier, then added some leveling sand. I spread it out really well, made sure it was at least an inch thick and nice and level. And to finish up the prepping process, I laid these paver base panels on top so I can go ahead and lay my pavers. I made sure they were nice and level, then repeated the same process over and over until all my pavers were laid. Once the pavers were laid, I added these trim pieces. We then added some of this polymeric sand in between all the joints, used the broom to sweep it in between every crack, then misted it off with a garden hose and let it sit overnight. Then just like that, the pavers were all finished up. Now that the patio is framed out and screened in, we're going to build out the inside. It's really nice to have this blank canvas so we can do whatever we want, so we're going to take advantage of it and see how nice we can make this thing. So far we spent $5,621 building the exterior of this patio, and that includes the half-inch sheathing that I'm screwing into the walls. They're going to be covered in stucco, but I'll show you that later on in the video. We next had to frame out the island that we're going to install in the center of this patio, which will be 24 inches wide by 7 feet long. I built the entire frame out of pressure treated 2x4s and secured them together using 3.5-inch exterior decking screws, then repeated the same process over and over until all the frame pieces were put together. All the pressure treated 2x4s and screws for the framing ran us $216, which brings the total to $5,837 so far, which is still just over $16,000 cheaper than a contractor quoted me. But we still have a lot to do, so let's see if we can stay well under the original $22,000 quote. After I finished framing, I screwed all the pieces together, and I had to make sure this island is perfectly level, because later in the video I'm going to be pouring a concrete countertop over this frame and I don't want it to settle funny. Once the framing was leveled, I pre-drilled and used 4-inch concrete screws to secure the framing to the concrete slab. Then just like that, the framing to the island was all finished up. Now that the framing is finished, I pre-drilled some holes into the studs so I can run some electrical. But since this patio is screened in, that doesn't make it waterproof. So I decided to run the electrical inside of this conduit and these waterproof boxes. Just in case we end up getting a storm one day and everything gets wet, I just want to prevent issues. And it isn't even that much more expensive. All the electrical for this entire patio build ended up running me $192, which brings a total to $6,033 so far. And for a full disclaimer, I'm not a professional electrician, I just felt like this was the right thing to do, which might be overkill, but what else are you gonna do when you got millions of people watching your videos critiquing every single thing you do? Just say fuck and do it anyway. For the wire I used Romex 12-2, then use my snake to go all the way to the other side of the conduit, taped the snake to the wire, then pulled it through. I used PVC cement to make sure everything was nice and tight, then pulled the rest of the wire through the last electrical box. Then just like that, all the electrical was ran in the walls and ready for the next step. Now that the electrical's finished up, it's time to finish installing the rest of the sheathing. I'm using cheap 1/2" OSB because it's going to be covered with stucco that I'll show you later on in the video. Since we're going to be installing a grill in this patio, we decided to use some of this concrete cement board and put it on all the spots that'll be next to the grill to help prevent the fire. This stuff cuts kind of like sheetrock. You just strike a line with your razor blade, snap it with your hand, then that's it. But this is one of those projects that my wife and I thought would only take 2 weeks, and here we are 6 weeks later and we're still not done. There was just so much we didn't take into consideration at first, like how long things take to come in the mail, how long it takes for cement to dry, and what kind of tile we're gonna pick out. Have you ever tried picking tile out with your wife? It's a freaking process to say the least. But after a week of trying to figure it out, we both came out on the other side unscathed, untouched, and ready to work. The grill's gonna go up against the wall that we're sheathing, so we decided to add some tile work and a hood system so it can suck the smoke out. So I had to drill a hole in the center of the wall for the exhaust. Now that we finished sheathing, it's time to prep the wall so we can do some tile work. We made sure this piece of 1/2" OSB was perfectly level, then screwed it into the wall because it's gonna work as a guide to make sure our tiles start off nice and level. We then cut our tile edge trim and got the mortar ready because it was time to lay some tile. I started off by spreading a thin layer of mortar all the way up to the top of the wall so I can install my tile edge trim. You basically just stick the trim edge to the mortar, make sure it's level, then haul ass doing tile work all the way till you get to the top before the mortar dries, just in case you need to shift the trim edge. And if you've never done tile work before and you want to do it, don't be scared. As long as you do your research and you prep properly, you're going to be fine. And having a laser level helps tremendously, but I don't have one, so I'm doing it the ghetto way, which will also work just fine. All the tiles, mortar, grout, and trim pieces ran me $344, which brings the total to $6,377. And I'll link all the materials in the description just in case you want to do this yourself. After doing a couple of rows, I made sure they were nice and level, then repeated the same process over and over all the way till we got to the top. And I'm not gonna lie, my wife and I had a blast doing this together. We talked about a bunch of stuff and it was a pretty nice moment, not to get too touchy. To cut the tiles, we used this manual tile cutter that we got from Lowe's, and it worked just as good as one of those expensive tile cutters that shoot water everywhere, except this thing's much cheaper and there's no water mess, so if you're gonna do tile work, get yourself a manual one because it works just as good. But then just like that, the entire wall was all tiled up. Now that we let the mortar set overnight, we had to remove the spacers so we can grout in between the tiles. To do this, we used bright white sanded grout, then poured it into a 5-gallon bucket and put water over it, then mixed it until it was the consistency of something like peanut butter. We then used the plastic spatula and went to town filling in all the cracks, but working in small sections at a time because you don't want this stuff to dry onto the tile. And the day we were doing this, it was 102 degrees out, which made the grout dry so much quicker. So I continued to work in small sections while my wife used a damp sponge to get rid of the excess. Then I had my son come over so I can teach him a little bit about tile work so he's not completely clueless when he grows up. I then finished off the top part of the wall, then came back an hour later with a damp microfiber to remove any excess grout. But now that the tiled wall's all finished up, I had to install an outlet that the hood's gonna plug into. And I'm using a water resistant outlet with a waterproof flip cover, which should work just fine because I'm not expecting this area to get any rain or moisture because it is completely covered. But I then made some marks so I can drill a hole using a masonry drill bit so I can install my hood. I then clipped the hood system onto the screws, plugged it in, then ran the ducking to the outside. I next put on the top piece to hide the ducting, then went outside and installed the vent cover. I then removed the plastic, installed the screens, made sure it worked, then just like that the hood system was all installed. Now that the tiled wall's finished up, we're stapling on this metal netting onto the sheathing because it's going to help the stucco stick to the wall easier and not crack over time. We picked up a couple bags of stucco, then mixed them with water in a 5-gallon bucket till we got a peanut butter consistency. I then started from the bottom and worked my way up in thin layers, then repeated the process over and over until all the stucco was all finished up. It took us about 7 hours to put on the first layer, including the metal netting, but this was one of those things that was so satisfying to do and we really just had a good time doing it. Once we finished the first layer, we let it sit for about 20 minutes, then used this little comb thingy that I made to draw a bunch of lines in it so when we put on the next layer, it'll stick properly. And while the stucco dried, I went ahead and started framing out the spot for the trash can. And the reason I didn't frame this out earlier in the video is because the trash can hadn't come in the mail yet, and I really wanted exact measurements before I framed it out. I then stapled down some more netting so I can stucco this wall as well. And at this point in the build, we've spent $6,922, including the stucco, the netting, and the trash can. And I was starting to get worried because I really wanted to stay under 10 grand for the entire project and I was getting really close to there, so we'll see in the end of the video what the final price is. But once I finished stuccoing the wall with the trash can, I let them sit for a couple days so I can add the final layer. This took quite a bit of time to do because it's the finished layer, but I took my time because I really wanted it to come out as nice as possible. And like I said, I didn't want to frame anything out until I had things in the mail, which is why I wasn't able to frame around where the grill is going to go, but once I got it in the mail and I knew the exact measurements, I went ahead and framed out this part too. I used regular sheathing for the front side of the island, but this side here, I went ahead and installed some more of the cement board because the grill's going to butt right up to it. After I finished stuccoing, I went ahead and framed out the other side that's going to butt up to the other side of the grill, and it's also going to have a refrigerator underneath. And I used pressure treated wood for this entire build to try to make everything as water resistant as possible, even though I'm not expecting too much rain to come in here in the first place. But then just like that, the island was finished up and ready for a countertop. Now that the stucco's all finished up, we're gonna let it dry for a couple days and build a countertop. We started off by picking up a few sheets of 1/2-inch hardy board, making some measurements, then cutting it out with a skill saw. And the reason we're doing this is because we've decided to pour our own concrete countertop because we just like the way that it looks. We measured and carefully cut out each piece and put them in their place before screwing anything in. We then made sure everything was as close to level as possible, ran a chalk line, then screwed everything in on the chalk line mark. We also added duct tape to the cracks to make sure no concrete leaks through while it's wet. Then picked up these concrete countertop molds, cut them to size, and screwed them directly into the hardy board. These are pretty cool because once the countertop dries, you just snap them off and that's it. We had to miter cut all the edges, but there was still a tiny little crack that you can see through, so we added some duct tape there to make sure none of the concrete leaks out. And since there's going to be a 12-inch overhang, we added some of these 2x4s as support until the countertop dries. To make sure the countertop doesn't crack, we had some leftover netting from the stucco, so we decided to use it on the countertop. Then it was time to pour the countertop, so we picked up 6 bags of this Quikrete Pro Finish 5000, mixed the crap out of it, then started pouring it into the mold. And I made the first batch a little thick, so I went ahead and made sure that the rest of the batches were more liquidy to try to make sure there's not as many air bubbles into it to give us a nice smooth finish. And of course I had to have my son come help. I swear by the time this kid's 20, he's gonna be a freaking professional in so many different things. And I know it was only 6 bags of concrete, but mixing them by hand was a crap ton of work to the point where I wish I would have just rented one of those concrete mixing machines. I then used this 1x4 to help me make the concrete look nice and flat, worked it a little bit until it looked like this, let it sit for about 4 hours, then came back to flatten out any high spots with a water bottle, and I'll tell you, this is definitely the most important step if you want to get a nice flat countertop. After waiting a couple days, the countertops were nice and dry, and it was time to remove the forms. I removed the tape, then pulled down the forms until they snapped off. And this part was so freaking satisfying, made it feel like all the work was totally worth it. We did find a couple of bubbles on the edges, but we're still super satisfied with the way this thing turned out. But then just like that, the countertop was all finished up. Now that the countertop's finished up and the stucco's been sitting for about 5 days, it's time to paint it. The color's called Balanced Beige, and we chose it because it's going to give the room a nice calm feel. So far in the build, we've spent $8,682, and that includes all the materials for the countertop, the stucco paint, the grill that we're going to show you later on in the video, and the fridge. And while Hope finished painting, I had to cut out these pressure treated 2x6s that I've been having dry out in my garage for the past 2 months. And the reason I dried them out so well is because pressure treated wood is really moist, and I'm going to be staining this wood, so I wanted it to be as dry as possible so the stain sticks properly. I painted on a thick ass layer of stain, then let it set up overnight. The next day I installed them onto the ledges using some construction adhesive because I don't want to see any screws, but if they warp over time I'll go ahead and screw them down just to make them last as long as possible. After installing all the ledges, I decided to add an LED strip underneath the countertop just to give it that extra pop. Once the LEDs were finished up, it was time to install this expensive ass trash can. This thing was like $300 and that's on the cheaper side of slide out patio trash cans. After installing the trash can, I went ahead and installed another one of those water resistant outlets, then slid the grill into its place, And at this point, things were really starting to come together. We also went ahead and installed the refrigerator. I then climbed on top of the counter and made some measurements so we can install some more lighting. We just felt like the space looked a little empty, so we decided to add some pendant lights. So we drilled some holes and snaked the wire to the ceiling light so everything will be on the same switch. After wiring up the pendant lights, I went ahead and finished wiring them to the other light while Hope installed the light bulbs. We then made sure they worked, and while I was up there I decided to install a fire alarm because at the end of the day there is a grill underneath the second floor of my house and I don't want it to burn down. And we also added a fire extinguisher. But I then did some caulking around the spots that needed it. Then swept the floor really well so I can install the patio furniture that I picked up from Lowe's. This patio furniture ran us exactly $400, and to us it was totally worth it because it's really well built and designed to be outside. And it looks pretty badass too. I'll link them down in the description below. But now that the patio is almost finished up, it's time to install the sprinklers. When we first bought the house, the first thing we wanted to do was install some sprinklers, but then we spiraled out of control and ended up building a fence, a gym, a shed, a patio, and now we're finally doing the sprinklers. We rented this machine so we can dig a trench, which ran us $175, but it was totally worth it because we did the entire yard in just 20 minutes. Then my neighbor Tom came over to help out, so we spread out a bunch of 1-inch PVC pipes and basically built the entire sprinkler system above ground before we put it into the trench. We used primer and PVC cement and gave every sprinkler head a shutoff valve, then used a ton of Teflon tape to connect the hose that came with the sprinkler head to the PVC. To make sure I can flush out the system in the winter time so the pipes don't freeze, I built this valve that I can connect my air compressor to, so I can shoot compressed air through the pipes and drain them. I then connected the air compressor valve closest to the house, then put the access box over it to make sure that it fits, finished running the rest of the PVC to my water supply, then turned on the water for about 5 minutes to flush out any dirt and debris that may have got into the system because we don't want it in the sprinkler heads. And for the sprinkler heads, we went with a company called IrriGreen because they make the most badass sprinkler system on the market. And the reason I think they're the best is because I'm going to be able to water all the grass in my backyard with just 2 sprinkler heads. With a normal sprinkler system, I would need like 20 sprinkler heads to water all my grass, which is a lot more work to install and consumes a lot more water. But that's not the case with the system, and I'll show you why in a minute. After connecting the sprinkler heads and running the wires, we made sure the system had no leaks, then we went ahead and buried it. We then had to install the sprinkler controller, which is a super easy plug and play system. You just screw this bracket into the house, install the box, and make sure you're near an electrical supply and some Wi-Fi. This is a smart sprinkler system that you can calibrate to the shape of your yard, so it'll only spray water in the areas that you want it to. Each sprinkler head can shoot up to 30 feet in any direction, and if it's about to rain and your sprinkler system is scheduled to turn on, it'll track the weather and tell your sprinklers not to turn on so Mother Nature can water your grass for you. After installing the sprinklers, you just download their app and pin a dot wherever you want the sprinklers to spray, and that's it. I'll link them in the description below just in case you want to get yourself one. But now that the sprinklers are all finished up, we wanted to install some string lights in between the patio and the gym that we built in a previous video. I drilled some holes and used these eye hooks as an anchoring point, used the zip tie to connect them to the hooks, and ran them from the patio to the gym. Then just like that, the entire patio and sprinklers were all finished up. Little over a month and a half to complete and cost us $9,412, which turned out to be a little over $10,000 cheaper than a contractor quoted us. But there's still a lot more to do, so click subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.